Cool. Right. So, welcome to my talk on Joomla 3.6. I'm Chris Davenport. I'm on the production leadership team, and I'm the release team leader for Joomla 3.6. I should start by telling you a little about myself. Get the right key on the keyboard. Who was here on my talk on Friday on Joomla 4 architecture? That's pretty much everybody, right? Okay, that's kind of good because that gives me a little opportunity here. I actually come from Britain, from that location there, but you've heard a little bit about me before if you went on the Joomla 4 architecture. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit something about me that you don't already know, that in fact almost nobody knows. And that is, I actually live in right next to an area which is designated as ancient woodland. And that's what my back garden basically looks like in springtime. And when I'm not doing Joomla work, I actually like to go out and photograph moths, believe it or not. I actually set up a light trap and trap these moths and photograph and record them. So it's a kind of a citizen science experiment, and all this stuff is officially recorded. So I go have a great deal of fun just photographing these moths. So I thought I'd just share with you a few photographs from the records, really, of what I've seen over the past several years. So I don't just do Joomla, I don't just do computers, I actually do get involved in other stuff as well. So there you go, there's a little extra gem for you. So that's not what I want to talk about today, of course. What I want to talk about is Joomla 3.6, which is a minor release in the Joomla cycle. And like all minor releases, it's kind of sandwiched in between the bigger ones. And what goes into these minor releases? Well, it's an opportunity for us to introduce new features into Joomla. And, but we have to do it in a way which is completely backwards compatible. So we're not allowed to break backwards compatibility in a minor release. That goes, we have that opportunity only in the major ones, like 4.0 will be the next major one. That's because we follow the semantic versioning scheme nowadays. But the other function of minor releases from this point onwards, or at least from 3.6 onwards, is actually to help us smooth the path towards Joomla 4. So some of the features that I'm going to talk about are intended to smooth that path, and you'll find that in future releases beyond 3.6, so 3.7, 3.8, whatever, however long it goes, we'll also be thinking about very much in terms of what can we do to make it easier to migrate your sites or your extensions or whatever up to Joomla 4. So the roadmap, as it is at the moment, this is where we are right now. The current release is 3.4.5, and very shortly we should have 3.5 released. The scheduled date for that to go stable is 1st of December. It seems that we're pretty much on target right now. It could, of course, slip. We don't know. But we seem to be OK right now. And 3.6, we're tentatively looking at first quarter of next year. That's the target date, is towards the end of March. Again, that might slip, depends on what's ready, what isn't, but that's what we're aiming for right now. So what about the goals for this release? Well, if you read the developer portal, you'll find it lists two goals. The first is to improve Joomla translation and multi-language support. And the second is to build a powerful platform for adding hypermedia APIs to Joomla CMS applications. That's what it says. The second I'm going to come to and talk about in a bit more detail. The first one, I don't have anything planned right now for that. But I'm very much open to suggestions as to what we can do to improve multi-language support, in particular in Joomla. I have some experience of doing multi-language sites, and I think it works pretty good. It functions well, but the real pain point is actually setting these sites up. It's actually very difficult to get a site set up in multi-language. Like adding a new article or adding a new menu, for example, is way harder than it needs to be, I'm sure. And we could really do with improvements to the user experience on getting multi-language sites set up. So if you've got any ideas on how we can improve that experience, I'd like to hear from you, and maybe we can put some PRs together to actually put something into 3.6 to make that better. So I'm going to talk a bit about the new features that I'm expecting to see in 3.6. This isn't a definitive list by any means, and it may be that somebody comes up with a really great idea that for a new feature that can go in 3.6. We're open to suggestions. We're open to new pull requests for new features to go into it. So the first one that we really want to get in there is this new media manager. This has been ongoing for quite some time. It's a great contribution by Budima. It's sort of ready in a sense that that it's developed, it's there, it works. But we have a little problem, which is nothing to do with Budima. It's not his fault. It's actually our fault. It's PLT's fault. He's kind of built it on the wrong platform, and that's our fault for misdirecting him. And we need him to actually change the MVC that it's built on top of. Budima himself, I think, is a little tied up and he's not actually got the time. So I believe the Dutch Joomla group has volunteered to.
Beatrice is starting the MVC production. The Joomla group probably will add to that in December, depending on the state.
Okay, so we have some volunteers that are stepping in to assist us with getting that media manager ready for 3.6. The other feature that I think is really exciting is custom fields, which is a contribution by Alon Moritz. Met him for the first time a few weeks back. Really great guy. He's done an extension called DP Fields, which allows you to add fields, custom fields into article and user managers. And the interesting thing is he's done it exactly the right way to do this sort of thing. So we really want to get this into the Joomla release, partly because it answers an awful lot of people's requirements. There's a lot of people wanting to add additional fields to the article manager, for example. And there's various different ways that people have attempted to do it. But Alon's way of doing it is exactly the right way that you should do it. So we want to get that into the core. It answers sort of 80% of people's requirements. And it also helps us to, or it will help site integrators particularly moving towards Joomla 4, because this will kind of carry over into Joomla 4 as well. Be aware, though, it's not a CCK. Okay, this is not a replacement for K2 or anything like that. This is pretty simple stuff. And in a sense, it's really mainly a developer feature, or really a site integrator feature. Really, it's a way in which you can customize a site by adding additional fields into the system. The other new feature I want to mention is the new router. This has been ongoing for certainly months, but possibly even years. Hannes has worked very, very hard over many years on trying to improve the router in Joomla. We were really hoping to get this into Joomla 3.5, but we heard recently that it's still not quite ready, that there's still issues, and we've got to sort them out. We don't want to put this into Joomla until it is absolutely ready and tested and working. So we bounced it off Joomla 3.5, and hopefully we're now going to get it into 3.6. But we really need testers. Okay, we need this stuff to be tested. It's got to be solid. If you're an extension developer, please, right now after this event, download the new router, test it against your extensions. Make sure your extensions still work with the new router, and report any bugs. We don't want to be committing this code in 3.6 and then suddenly the extension developers turn up and say, oh, it's broken or it's not working or something like that. We need it tested right now. Okay. So the other, probably the big headline feature in 3.6, at least as far as I'm concerned, is the addition of Hypermeter API into Joomla. And I want to spend a little bit more time in going into this one, because it's a favorite of mine. I'm not going to go into what REST web services are. I guess most of you are developers, is that right? Is it? Yeah? Good. So you should probably already be familiar with what it is and what it does. Why add Hypermeter API? This is a question. This is actually an old slide from many years ago when I first started talking about this stuff. And I used to have to answer this question regularly, why add a Hypermeter API? I don't get asked this question anywhere near as often as I used to, because people naturally just assume that it should be there. It's obvious. But I'll just run through it. More people are using AJAX kind of requests on their websites, and we need that API to back up those requests. More people are using mobile devices. More people are using CLI applications, command line applications. I spend a great deal of my time now writing CLI applications. 5 years ago, I didn't spend any time writing CLI. Now, probably more than 50% of my time is writing CLI stuff. More people now are also expecting APIs for integration. So it's not just about building monolithic websites anymore. We have multiple websites that need to communicate with one another. We have websites having to communicate with back-end IT systems. Everything has to be integrated, and everything has to be working together in some way. And of course, there's the Internet of Things coming up as well, which is the ultimate in integration problems, really. You've got stuff integrating with other stuff all over the place, and we need Hypermedia APIs to actually do that integration work. So how do we actually add the Hypermedia API into Joomla? Well, at the moment, we have the CMS, and it's running on top of the Joomla platform, however you define that. We could, of course, put an extension into the CMS, add it in as a component, let's say. And I know certainly other people have done that and achieved it that way. But we actually want to keep some sort of separation between the API and the CMS, partly for backwards compatibility concerns, but also because it gives us a great deal more freedom in what we can do with the API if it's not actually tied too closely to the CMS. So our plan at the moment is to actually build it on top of the Joomla framework, specifically version 2 of the framework. So it's going to be a standalone application built on the framework v2, and it's going to be a separate download. Okay, so it's not going to be part of your standard Joomla CMS download. You're not going to go to joomla.org, click on the button, and get the CMS and the API. You will have to go to a separate location. I don't know where. We haven't thought about that yet, but a separate button that you have to click to download the API from somewhere else, or even a different button on the same screen, or something like that. I don't know. One of the things I'm looking at the moment is minimum requirements, because being a separate application does give us a certain freedom in that we can actually have a slightly increased minimum PHP requirement. And I'd kind of like to go to PHP 5.4 on this if possible. And I'll mention why in just a second. We can think of this application as a kind of temporary thing. When we move to Joomla 4, it's no longer required because Joomla 4 does this stuff natively. So if you want an API in Joomla 3, it'll be a separate application. Once you upgrade to Joomla 4, you can delete this application. You don't need it anymore. Again, one of the reasons we want to do this is because it's going to help with migrations to some degree. The Joomla 4 API, the Hypermedia API, will be backwards compatible with the version that we're putting into 3.6. So although your code may need to be altered, data need to be. So let's have a look at the architecture of this standalone application. It's almost a classic MVC. It's not quite there, but it's kind of customized. But if we start at the left-hand side there with the front controller, we'll actually supply two front controllers by default within the distribution, one for web access and one for command line access. If people are interested in contributing other front controllers for other protocols or other channels, then by all means submit a pull request, and we'll almost certainly take those and put them in the distribution as well. So the controller there is really a kind of a coordinating entity there. It sets the interaction style for the API. By default and by our preference is going to be for REST interactions on these on the API. But there's a lot of interest from the enterprise guides about putting SOAP access in there as well. So we'll almost certainly support SOAP out of the box on there as well. And then on the rendering side, the output side, we can write renderers for pretty much any format you want. Those are just a few examples there. At the moment, we're almost certainly going to support HAL in JSON format. I'm kind of interested in doing Uber as well. That's a new format that's coming up. Mike Amundsen has done some interesting work on that. It seems to have some advantages over HAL. And of course, there's the SOAP XML renderer as well, which we need. And I put a little box down at the bottom there with Profile XML there, which actually takes some of the responsibility of. It's a bit like the template on the CMS side, and I'll say a bit more about that in a few slides' time. The model does some kind of interface bit work in there. It's not particularly interesting. The interesting bit on the back end there is the integration adapters. We will, of course, put an adapter in there to allow you to connect into the existing Joomla 3 MVC structure. That's an essential. That's the whole reason we're putting in there in the first place. And I've mentioned a couple of other integration adapters down there, which I'll say more about in a few slides. But basically, we should be able to integrate with Joomla 3 via a service layer and via Joomla 4's new service layer as well. So the entry points, we're creating a couple of entry points into Joomla. So on the web side, your existing entry point is index.php. So that's whenever a web request comes in, it goes to the index.php. That's your front controller. Well, that at least fires up that first part of that front controller. It's the bootstrap. We're going to introduce a new API.php, which will be the front controller or your entry point for these API requests. And there will be an API.php in the CLI directory as well to do your CLI tasks. Anything, of course, that is that you can do over the web API, you can do over CLI, so you can script everything. Right? These things will be configurable, so if you don't like the fact that you've got API.php in the Joomla root, you can move it somewhere else, and it's just a matter of reconfiguring a couple of variables in the config or something like that to change where it is. You can put it in a subdirectory or put it in a separate subdomain or whatever you want to do with it. As far as the API itself is concerned, this will pretty much follow the work that we've been doing in the Web Services Working Group. And if you're interested to know more, there is documentation on the wiki. There's the URL. If it's too long to write down, just Google for Joomla Web Services. It'll come up. It's like the first thing that comes up. We've also got a page on the volunteers portal as well. So if you want to get involved in actually defining what that API actually looks like, then that's where to go. We've got some draft documents on there at the moment that mostly written by me over the past few years. The intention here is that in parallel with the development work on 3.6 for the API, we'll finalize those documents. So when we actually launch 3.6, we should have a kind of definitive version of those specification documents that can, I think, help extension developers in particular to understand how to make your API similar to the core API. You don't have to follow those standards. It's entirely optional, but it's probably a good idea to try and do that if you can. So I'm not going to go very deep into any of this stuff, but just to give you a flavor of the sort of things that we're looking at. The API URLs that we're recommending and that we'll be supporting in the core are basically the industry standard URLs, if you like. They're what people expect from an API these days. So /articles will get you a collection of articles. If you want a specific article, you put an ID on the end. If you want information about the category that an article belongs to, then you can go down another level. It's that kind of thing. And the reason we can do that is because this is a separate standalone application. We're not constrained by the CMS router. Okay, we can provide our own router, which can do these nice clean URLs. no particular problem. It's not a hard thing to build these URLs, but if we try to do it within the CMS, we would run into problems very quickly. I mentioned a little bit about content negotiation. This is one area where I'd like to actually pull in a third-party library to do this for us. The one I'm looking at the moment particularly is this one by Will Durand. And this is actually one of the reasons why I'd like to push the PHP minimum up to 5.4 actually, because there's a 5.4 dependency in this library. However, you might have noticed, if you've been particularly attentive, that there's a kind of a conflict here. If we bump the minimum up to 5.4, then it's going to be difficult to use the API for migration, data migration purposes, because that would mean that somebody who's currently locked into 5.3 with a Joomla 3 installation then can't actually use the content negotiation to get them to migrate the data up to Joomla 4. So it may be that actually we drop this library and have to downgrade it or something. I don't know how we're going to fix that particular issue, but we'll sort that out later on. So this package is actually quite nice. We're going to use it for negotiating content type, but we can also use it for negotiating encoding, character set, and language. And it is fully RFC compliant, so all the internet RFCs, it correctly handles the negotiation for those. Which basically means, in terms of web requests, if a client submits a request with an accept header, then we're going to use that accept header to determine the interaction style, whether it's REST or SOAP, and the various formats and so forth that the output is going to be rendered in. And this will be configurable. So if you decide that you want your entire API to run on Uber in JSON format, then it's just a matter of setting the configuration. Say, yeah, this accept header is going to result in this format on the response. So I want to talk a bit about profiles. I mentioned them on an earlier slide. They're kind of like they take the role of the template in the CMS. So they help to define what the responses are going to look like and how they're dealt with. They're also a bit like schemas in the database. So they're like schemas for resource representations. They'll be written in XML, and they'll also be versionable. So you can have, if you change your data model or you change something in the database, you can create a new version of that profile. And the version numbers will be taken into consideration during the content negotiation. So you can link these, you can wire these things up so that a particular request can get routed through to a particular version of a profile, so that you can help with upgrades and so forth like that. So just a little diagram to call out all the various things that depend on this profile, because it's not just used for the one thing. We're going to pull out a lot of other stuff from that profile information. So the XML file, we can also generate public profiles. The XML file itself is like an internal document. It's like the access.xml or the config.xml in the component. It's not something that you expect the consumer, the website visitor, to ever see. Right? It's an internal configuration kind of thing. There's nothing private in there, but it's not something you typically want you expect clients to consume. But there are public profile formats that we want to be able to generate automatically from that XML, and things like JSON LD context and ALPS documents. There's no particular reason why we can't write adapters for any of those kind of things. We'll probably pick one just to do with the default distribution. But if people want to write others, then contribute the code and we'll include them in distribution. The integration adapters need configuring so that they're wired up so that we know when a particular request comes in, where it gets routed, what code actually gets executed. So the configuration of those adapters is also part of the responsibility of that profile. Output mapping and input parsing, this is to do with really shaping the data, so deciding what information is included in a response and what is not included. and also doing any transformations that are required. So, for example, you don't want to expose the exact contents of your database to the outside world directly. You need to hide that information, really, so that you're not dependent, you're not locking the clients into the servers. You can allow these two things to evolve independently. An example of that would be, let's say, the state variable in content, where you've got 0 is unpublished, 1 is published, -2 is trashed, or something, whatever the numbers are. You don't want to expose those numbers, really, because they're meaningless to clients, and you're creating a dependency on those particular numbers. So it's better to actually transform them into something else. So maybe to transform them to a string. So 0, you actually, on the public API, will be unpublished, and 1 is published, or whatever. And it goes both ways. So you can transform those back if you're doing a post request. You just include the string, and it gets transformed into the appropriate number internally. The mapping itself isn't actually done in the profile, but you link to the mappers from the profile. And the other thing that needs thinking about a little bit, I'm not entirely sure that we'll do it this way, is to actually, how do you set up the routes internally? How do you wire up the routes, know which components to go to, and so forth? Maybe we derive the routes from the profiles as well. So I mentioned a little bit about integrations. The big one, of course, the most important one, is that we should be able to link into legacy MVC on Joomla 3, so that what that means is that we can call a particular model, particular method on a model in response to a particular request, or call up JTable or something like that. So we're hooking into that code in the legacy extensions. That's kind of hacky. It's not nice code. It's not always going to work. But we have workarounds for that. You can also create helper classes, which will help you to work around any issues. So if you find that you can't call particular methods directly because it fails for some reason, then you can write a helper class which will actually help you get around that. These sorts of things hopefully are temporary. It's because we can't interfere with any of the code in Joomla 3. We can't touch your extensions or anything like that, but we want to try and make it as easy as possible to do the integration. So if you find that you've got a component and it doesn't work by calling the methods directly, then there is a possibility of just writing a helper class to get around those sort of issues. However, there is a cleaner way of doing these things, and that is to introduce a service layer. And Joomla 4 will definitely have a service layer as part of its fundamental architecture. And calling the service layer gives you a nice clean API where everything does work very, very nicely. And I'll mention something about Joomla 3 service layers in a second. Anybody at the previous session over in the other room? Yeah, okay. There's a few. Catch up with that session on the video, because what he was saying is pretty much exactly what I'm saying here. He went into in much more detail on service layer stuff. Another interesting thing is that because we're a standalone, the API is a standalone application, we're not limited to just integrating with Joomla anymore. We can actually integrate with other stuff as well. And I put here just as a kind of an interesting idea that actually you could integrate with WordPress. We could actually write a WordPress integration adapter and expose WordPress through the Joomla API. We probably won't do that in the default distribution, but if somebody wants to have a go and play with that, then they're more than welcome to do it. I don't know about you, but I often build websites where you've got, say, a blog that is running on WordPress and it's embedded in a Joomla site. So as far as the site visitor is concerned, it's all one site. It all looks the same, but you've actually underlying there, you've got actually the two applications running. You'd like, ideally, to have the API to have the same seamless integration as well. So an integration adapter on the back end of this thing will achieve that for you. And you can integrate with other stuff as well. I mean, if you've got some weird and wonderful internal application that's running on some server somewhere, then there's no particular reason why you can't run a little adapter write a little adapter for that and integrate with that as well. So the one word of advice on this, if you're particularly if you're an extension developer, is don't expose your data model. All right, the whole purpose of the API really is to decouple the clients from servers and allow the two to evolve independently. So don't just think in CRUD terms and expose the data tables that you've got to the outside world. Make sure that you think about how to do the transformations to decouple these things. So don't take the easy path. To think about it first. API configuration, I'll just say a few words about this. There will be an admin component that you can install into Joomla 3.6 that will help you with the configuration of the API. You don't have to do it this way. You can actually directly edit that profile.xml file or the profile.xml files. But this is a little more user-friendly. It's a lot of menus and stuff like that you can actually drill down and change stuff there. It needs some improvement. If we've got some UX people, UI people around, then we could do with some help actually making that look nice and more intuitive than it currently is. But it is actually there. It's functional. It works. It's basically the red core component that is doing this. It just needs a little bit of improvement. We need something for API key management. It's pretty normal. You don't have to do it this way, but it's pretty normal nowadays to actually have API keys which control access to the API, and we need some sort of key management capability within Joomla to actually handle that. But it just occurred to me last night, in actual fact, that with the custom fields extension, actually we could probably just do it that way. So it may be that we just write a couple of plugins to add some additional fields into the user manager to handle the key management. So that might actually be a fairly simple problem to solve. And there will be at least one other config file around somewhere. It may not be this one, it may be something else, but we need some sort of configuration for the API just to set up paths and various other things that need to be done. So as I've sort of mentioned before, just be careful. Don't expect this thing to work straight out of the box and on your extensions. You may need to maybe tweak your extension a little bit just to make sure that it can be called from the API application. And if you don't have that capability to alter your own code, then like talking third-party code or something like that, then you may need to write a helper class just to get around those issues. But it's not necessarily going to be totally seamless out of the box to be able to do this stuff. That will get a lot easier in Joomla 4, of course, where effectively, if it works on the web, it'll work everywhere, and that's it should be kind of nice. A little bit of fun. This is something that came up, I think, in talks when we were talking about it at Jam Beyond. I think with Sarah, actually, who's at the back of the room there. We were talking about how to make this a bit more interesting to people, because the API stuff is basically for developers, right? It's not a user-facing feature at all. And how could we make it a bit more interesting for developers? So we thought, well, actually, we could put together a little Joomla app and distribute it with the API, so that people can stick it on their mobile phones and just have a little fun with it. Don't expect anything complicated with it. It's not going to be like a total admin backend on the app. It'll just be a very, very simple app just to demonstrate the use of the API, and maybe it's a starting point for your own code as well. So very, very simple. Probably the only thing it's going to do is post an article. Right? We haven't got the time or the resources to do anything more than that. If other people want to take it forward and make it more sophisticated and add functionality to it, then please knock yourself out. We'd love to see that code, but as far as my expectations are concerned, if we can just do that one thing, I'll be quite happy. So I want to mention a little bit more about Joomla 4, which might seem a bit strange in a 3.6 talk. But it is actually quite important, as I've said before, that the minor versions from 3.6 onwards will be trying hard to incorporate features and ideas that will assist you with migration and assist you, particularly extension developers, in actually getting their code compatible with 4 and migrating sites over to Joomla 4. It seems a bit of a distant thing at the moment, but Joomla 4 is steaming ahead, and we've got to be aware that now we can at least see it on the horizon. It's not just some complete distant idea or anything. So Joomla 4 will have this idea of a service layer, and if you saw Vijay's talk earlier, you'll know that this is actually a really good way to architect applications these days. So one of the things we want to do is to actually backport the service layer from Joomla 4 into Joomla 3.6. And just in case you don't know what a service layer is, I'll very, very quickly run through this. Vijay's talk is actually much better than mine on this. It goes in much more detail, so see the video if you weren't actually on the talk there. So basically the CMS is kind of a federation of components. It's almost a loose collection of components, but they're coupled to some degree at the moment in ways that there really shouldn't be. Ideally, we actually want them to be silos. We want them to be completely standalone, independent mini applications, really. And it might seem that silos, they get a bit of a bad press. They talk about information silos being a bad thing, but they're not necessarily a bad thing. The problem is that we don't have the APIs to access them. If we have the APIs, it gets a lot easier. So no APIs tend to lead to bad practice, like, for example, calling another component's model. I've seen a lot of code. It's probably code in the core, in actual fact, where one component will instantiate something like JModel content or whatever the class is. So it's instantiating another component's model in order to do some work. To be fair, there's probably no better way to do it right now. It's kind of unavoidable, but it's not a very good idea to do that. We don't make any backwards compatibility promises about those models. All right? So if we change a model in a component, whatever's calling it is going to break, and that's not good. We don't want stuff to break. Components should only be loosely coupled, and the way to solve this problem is to have a clearly defined API for all the components. So the problem really is where to put that API. Now, if you've read this book, has anybody read this book? We've got this book. A couple of people. Okay. I thoroughly recommend it. It's a book on application architecture. You can tell it's about architecture because there's a picture of a bridge on the front. Seems obligatory these days. My one complaint about this book is actually the word enterprise in there, because it's kind of off-putting. It makes you think, well, it's only about big enterprise stuff, multiple servers and big data and stuff like that. Actually, it isn't. It's really interesting. There's a lot of very, very useful information about how to build applications in there. And what it says, if you read this good book, is that if you're in the kind of situation where you've got more than one kind of client, and by client it means there's different kind of channels of communication into the system, so web or CLI or MQTT or whatever it is you're using. If you've got more than one of those kinds of clients, or if you have actions that need to be atomic across more than one transactional resource, which is another way of saying if you've got a situation where you're doing different things within a model. This is not database transactions. They're different things that as far as the model is concerned, they're actually independent. But as far as the user is concerned, you want the user experience to be that they're effectively atomic. So if one of them fails, the whole thing should be backed out at some point. So it's not something that is a direct model concern, but it's more a user concern, user-facing concern. So if you've got in that kind of either of those kinds of situations, then it's a good idea to use the service layer. And of course, we like layers, especially in cakes. But what is this about a service layer? Well, the idea is it provides a nice, clean API for us. It's a way of exposing the API, a nice, clean API to the world. It's also channel agnostic, as I've said, so it's different kinds of clients, but it's the same API regardless of what the client is. And it also allows you this coordination of responses. So you can do stuff that isn't directly a business concern, but it helps with the user-facing stuff, the presentation layer. So where does it go? Where does it fit in? Well, in the MVC triad, it fits in really in front of the model. So in between the controller view and the model, we should slot it in there. And what that ends up looking at is that we've got effectively two APIs there. So we've got an channel-independent API, which is like an internal API, which is exposed by the service layer. And then the existing API, which is kind of not very clearly defined in Joomla 3 for most components at any rate, is this channel-dependent API where the controller, you might call a controller task, for example, and you get a response out of that. So the channel-independent API is exposed by that service layer. And we can sum up the main function of that, the main responsibility of that service layer to be orchestration. Right? That's one way of summing it up. And if you were in my talk on Friday, I mentioned something about the different kinds of logic, so domain logic and application logic of being of different kinds, and we should actually separate those out so that the domain logic is the responsibility of the model. So the only kind of logic that should be in that model should be that domain logic, which is like your business rules, the really core stuff that you actually really care about. Your sort of referential integrity checks and what have you that you need to put in there. Everything else belongs either in the service layer or elsewhere. Some of that actually doesn't belong in the service layer, it's elsewhere, but that's sort of splitting hairs. But so diagrammatically, it looks a little bit like this. You have a command comes in, it goes through a command bus, which is routed through to a command handler. And the command handler then makes the calls out to the model. It may be multiple models, it may be multiple calls out to that model, whatever needs to happen at that point. And as a result of that, various events can be raised, and those get published out to whoever's listening, whoever needs to listen. So just very quickly running through the three elements of that command bus. The commands themselves are just very simple objects. They're immutable. You can't change them once you create them. There's no setters on them, so you can't mess them up again. They're value objects, so two commands are the same if they have the same value, effectively. So they may be distinct objects, but they can have the same value. And we can actually put quite a bit of the validation logic in the constructors for these things. So we can isolate some of the sort of basic validation logic in the constructors. Some of the more sophisticated validation logic you would probably have to put in the service layer, but the simple stuff can go in the constructor, and the effect of that is that it's pretty much impossible to create an invalid command. So if you get a command routed through to a command handler, you don't need to check that it's a valid command, because the fact that you've got a command means it must be valid. And because they're such simple objects, you can serialize them and put them on message queues, and you can shunt them around networks onto different servers and stuff like that. So the command bus has the responsibility of routing commands through to command handlers. And for each command, there is exactly one command handler. Right? And the reason why we want to do it that way is that you can actually decorate this command bus. So every single command coming into a system or into a particular component goes through that common pathway, which means that we can actually intercept those things and do some interesting things with the commands as they're going through the system. So for example, if I want to log every single command going through the system for debugging purposes, let's say, then I just wrap the command bus in a simple little bit of middleware, which will actually log all those commands as they go through. And I can also do things like filtering on the commands if I want to do particular stuff with them, crazy stuff like that, whatever you need to do. Now the command handlers themselves, this is generally where you would make calls into the model. 9 times out of 10, that's what you'll be doing in them. It's orchestration logic, so it's nothing, you're not doing any domain-specific stuff here. It's very, very lightweight logic, and they're usually very, very small classes. The service layer is a very lightweight layer. And bear in mind that you don't have to write the command bus code or anything like that. It's just there. Joomla provides that. All you've got to do is write the commands, which are drop-dead simple things, and the command handlers, which are very lightweight classes. Everything else, all the other code you've already got written anyway. And as an added bonus, you can actually type in on the command names, which makes the code a bit more robust and also a little bit more readable as well. So if we go back to this diagram here, we've got the command going into the command bus, routed out to the command handlers. If something happens in the model which is of interest, then the model will raise a domain event. So, for example, if we have a command like a customer registration thing, so a customer registers, we get a command coming in which might be called register customer, let's say. That's routed out through the handler, and the model registers the customer by creating a new database record or whatever. When it's completed that work, it will raise a domain event which might be called something like customer was registered, let's say. And that bubbles back up to that command bus, which then publishes it to all the listeners who are interested in that event. So a domain event is a record of something that happened in the past. It's a very, very simple object. Again, like the commands, it's immutable, it's a value object. And you can serialize these things and queue them up and shuffle them around networks and do whatever you want with them. And there is a publisher. Again, the Joomla by default will handle this for you. You haven't got to do the publication of these things. You haven't got to do the dispatching of these events. It runs after the command has been executed. In actual fact, will probably, almost certainly, in fact, implemented as the command bus in command bus middleware. So it's another one of those wrappers around the command bus that will fire as soon as the command is finished executing. And we'll provide a lot of different ways in which you can register listeners. So you can register a callback or a closure, or you can create a plugin which will listen to a domain event. And the domain event listers can basically contain anything you want. A classic example is sending out notification emails. So you don't want the logic of sending out emails to be cluttering up your domain logic. It's not domain logic. You don't want it in the models. It doesn't belong in the models. So you separate that out and put it into one of these domain event listeners. And it's possible also to create another command from within one of these listeners, and that again will just get bubbled up back into the command bus and executed in sequence. So I thought it'd be nice to just have a little look at some code. This isn't necessarily what it will look like exactly, but I just sort of threw something together just to illustrate the kind of code that you'll be writing in future if you use the service layer. So initially you would create, in the example I gave, register customer command, which will take the user's name and an email address. So on a web request, this would be pulling in the data from $_request via the JInput class. CLI would pull it off the command line. But wherever it comes from, all that's channel specific stuff. It would get the controller would just create the command to do that. It would grab an instance of the command bus, probably off the DI container, and it would then hand the command over to the command bus to handle that command. So that's all the code that you actually need in the controller to make use of the service layer. Command itself is extremely boring. It's just a data container, but the validation logic you could actually put into the constructor. So in this particular case, for example, you might want to validate that the email address is actually a valid email address. So you can run that through a little validator there that will throw an exception if it's not valid. And that means, because it's in the constructor, it means that you cannot create a command object that has an invalid email address in it. That then gets routed through to the command handler. And what you do in the command handler is pretty much up to you. The kind of things that you might do is grab an instance of a model, fire off the register command on that model. You pass it the data from that's contained within the command, those parameters there. We don't necessarily need to use getters on that. It could be that they're just public properties in there. But ideally, we want the command properties to be immutable, so that there shouldn't be any way of actually changing a command once it's been created. And then after the model's done its magic, we have a line of code there just to filter up bubble up those domain events back up to the command bus. It might not be exactly like that. There are other ways of doing it, but that's the kind of idea. I put that in just to give you an idea of what needs to happen. Basically, stuff that happens in the model, domain events that are raised in the model have to come back up to the command bus somehow. So ultimately, what we're doing is, by introducing this new layer, this service layer in here, where I just thought it'd be a good idea just to look at the different responsibilities of the layers to make sure that we get things in the right place. So the model is really only concerned with domain logic. It handles persistence at the moment. In Joomla 4, I should say, I'm getting ahead of myself there. We need to separate out persistence into a different layer as well, but right now that's handled in the same place. The service layer handles the application logic, and the kind of things that you can put in there are things like authorization checks and transactional wrappers. I put notifications and logging into the service layer. Technically, they belong in the domain event listeners, which are not really part of the service layer, but that's kind of splitting hairs a bit. The controller handles what controllers do now, pretty much: authentication, content negotiation, stuff like that. And we can also do things like aggregation in there. I'm not entirely sure that we have a use case that would actually require that kind of stuff, because in most cases you would do it in the service layer, but it could be done. There's possibility. I've thought of one or two areas where maybe you might want to do aggregation of content in the controller. So just to wrap it up, the service layer is optional. Remember, you don't have to refactor your code to use the service layer. But it can improve your code, and it's going to help you transition up to Joomla 4. And that just basically summarizes the architecture. The service layer, I think, is really, really important. So think about the integration adapters. If you've got the option to use the service layer instead of the legacy MVC, do it that way. And a quick summary of what we expect Joomla 3.6 to look like. New Media Manager, the custom fields extension. Hopefully that new router will be finally ready. Hypermeter API, which I think is the big flagship feature. The introduction of an optional service layer. And basically anything else that comes along in the next few months. So if you want to get involved, get in touch. That's my email address. I'm glad to hear your ideas and thoughts. And if you'd like to contribute, then please do get in touch. I'm afraid we're out of time for questions, so I'm just going to say thank you very much.